This video discusses violent crimes including murder. Viewer discretion advised. Colin Pitchfork, the man who broke the code. November 21, 1983, Narborough, Leicestershire, England. A 15-year-old girl named Linda Mann was found strangled on a quiet footpath. There were no witnesses. There was no obvious suspect, just a body, a community in shock, and a case that would go cold within weeks. 3 years later, the nightmare repeated. On July 31, 1986, another 15-year-old, Dawn Ashworth, was found murdered less than a mile from where Linda had died. The similarities were unmistakable. Same method, same age of victim, same isolated path. Police were now certain a single killer was responsible for both deaths, but they had no name to attach to him. What they did have was semen evidence from both crime scenes, and a scientist nearby named Alec Jeffreys had just discovered something revolutionary, a technique called DNA fingerprinting, capable of identifying a person from their genetic material with near total certainty. It had never been used to solve a criminal case before. Police approached Jeffreys and asked him to test the evidence. The results confirmed both girls had been killed by the same man, but ruled out their initial suspect entirely, a local teenager who had already confessed under pressure. For the first time in history, DNA had cleared an innocent man of murder. With no suspect left, police tried something unprecedented. They asked every male in the surrounding villages, more than 4,000 men, to voluntarily submit a blood sample for DNA testing. It was slow, exhausting work. Then, in a pub, a bakery worker named Ian Kelly was overheard bragging that he'd taken the test for a friend, using a fake passport to pose as him. That friend was Colin Pitchfork. Pitchfork was a married father with 2 young children, known to neighbors as an unremarkable local baker. When police finally tested his real DNA, it matched the samples from both murders. He confessed. In January 1988, Colin Pitchfork became the first person in the world convicted of murder using DNA fingerprinting, a technique that would go on to transform criminal investigation forever. He was sentenced to life in prison, later released on parole in 2021, and recalled to custody the same year after breaching his conditions. Lonnie Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper. Los Angeles, California, 1985. Women began disappearing from South Central LA, their bodies later found in alleys and dumpsters, many showing signs of sexual assault before death. The killings continued sporadically for years, then abruptly stopped in 1988, only to resume again in 2002, as if the killer had simply been sleeping. Investigators nicknamed him the Grim Sleeper. For over 2 decades, the case terrified a community that felt ignored by the wider city. Most of the victims were young black women, some involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, and residents accused police of not taking the killings seriously enough. Meanwhile, the murders kept happening. At least 10 women were confirmed dead, though investigators believe the true number may be far higher. The break came not from the killer's own DNA, but from his son's. In 2008, California expanded its use of familial DNA searching, a technique that scans offender databases not just for exact matches, but for close genetic relatives. When Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s son was arrested on an unrelated felony charge, his DNA profile showed a strong familial match to genetic material recovered from the Grim Sleeper crime scenes. Investigators quietly surveilled Franklin, eventually collecting a discarded piece of pizza crust from a party he attended to obtain his direct DNA. It matched perfectly. Franklin, a former LAPD garage attendant and city sanitation worker, had lived in the same South Central neighborhood the entire time, working alongside police, sometimes literally handling evidence vehicles. He was arrested in 2010. In 2016, he was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. He died on California's death row in 2020, having never revealed the full scope of his crimes. The Bear Brook murders, the case with no name. November 1985. Hikers in Bear Brook State Park, New Hampshire, discover a metal barrel containing the remains of a woman and a young girl. 15 years later, in the same park, a second barrel is found containing 2 more female victims. 4 bodies, no names, no missing persons reports that matched, and for decades, no idea who had killed them. Investigators eventually connected the case to a man who had lived nearby under one of several false identities, a drifter who moved constantly, married repeatedly, and vanished whenever suspicion arose. He had been arrested once, decades earlier, under a name that turned out to be fake, and had died in prison in 2010 on unrelated charges. His real identity still unknown at the time of his death. It took genetic genealogy, the same emerging science used to crack other cold cases, to finally unravel the mystery. Investigators built out family trees from DNA left behind, working backward through distant relatives on public genealogy databases. In 2017, they identified the killer as Terry Peter Rasmussen, a man who had used at least a dozen aliases across several states over 3 decades. 2 of the 4 Bear Brook victims were eventually identified as his own daughter and a woman believed to be her mother. The identity of the 4th victim remains unconfirmed to this day. Rasmussen had died in prison 7 years before investigators ever learned his true name. William Talbott II, The Hitchhiker's Confession That Never Happened. November 1987. A young Canadian couple, Tanya Van Coilenborg and Jay Cook, set off on a ferry trip to Washington State and never returned. Tanya's body was found first, in a ditch near Alger, Washington. Jay's body was discovered days later, more than 60 miles away, near a highway overpass. Both had been murdered by a stranger. For 30 years, the case sat unsolved, one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting cold cases. Investigators had DNA from the crime scene almost from the beginning, but with no match in any criminal database, the case stalled for decades. Then, in 2018, the same investigative genetic genealogy technique that had just cracked the Golden State Killer case was applied here. Detectives uploaded the crime scene DNA profile to a public genealogy website, built a family tree from distant cousins, and narrowed the search to a truck driver living less than an hour from where the bodies had been found. William Talbott II had no prior connection to the case, no criminal record for violence, nothing that would have put him on police radar without the DNA breakthrough. Detectives obtained a discarded item to confirm his DNA, and it matched. Talbott was arrested in 2018, more than 30 years after the murders. He denied any memory of the crime, and his defense argued the DNA evidence alone couldn't prove intent. The jury disagreed. In 2019, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Calvin Hoover, the killer who was never questioned. October 3, 1984. 9-year-old Christine Jessop vanished from her home in Queensville, Ontario. Her body was found months later in a wooded area, and the case triggered a massive investigation and public outcry. Police soon arrested a neighbor, Guy Paul Moran, based largely on circumstantial evidence and questionable forensic testimony. He was convicted of Christine's murder in 1992, but Moran was innocent. In 1995, DNA testing, still a relatively new tool for Canadian courts, definitively cleared him. He was exonerated and later awarded compensation for his wrongful conviction, but the actual killer remained unidentified for another 25 years. The real perpetrator had never even been a serious suspect. In 2020, investigators finally used genetic genealogy to crack the case. They built a DNA profile from crime scene evidence, traced it through distant family connections on public databases, and identified a man named Calvin Hoover, a family friend of the Jessops, who had been present during the search for Christine and had died by suicide in 2015, years before he was ever connected to the crime. He had spent 30 years living freely, entirely unsuspected, while an innocent man carried the weight of a conviction for a murder he didn't commit. These 5 cases span 3 countries and 4 decades, but they share the same underlying truth. Evidence doesn't expire. Somewhere in a lab freezer, a case file, or a distant relative's genetic test, the answer was always sitting there, waiting for the science to catch up. Every one of these killers believed enough time had passed. Every one of them was wrong. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.